Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight. It's the second part of our space that we took talking about your literature review. So tonight is the second of a two-part series. We started last night with an overview of a literature review. We touched a bit on the different types of the reviews and also when they might be suitable. So this evening, as promised, I'm going to take you into a bit more depth of actually conducting, and we're focusing on a critical review this evening. Some of the concepts I might be repeating from last night, maybe just in another way. So there is a form of recapping. But also please keep something with you where you can make notes. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session, so you have the opportunity of putting your questions into the question and answers section, and then we will spend some time on those after the presentation. So the presentations will be available to you, and the PowerPoints that I used last night as well as tonight is all in one presentation. So if you weren't able to attend last night, then you will have all the slides together in one presentation, and that will be available after tonight's session. So for now, let's start our session. I'm going to close my camera while I'm presenting, and then I'll open up the camera again once we start with the question and answers. Thank you so much. So as I said, last night we looked at the literature review, and I mentioned that a literature review is very similar to a project. Because it has an aim or a purpose, it has a research question for the literature review specifically. It on a master's doctoral level, or if you are choosing a specific type of literature review, there will be a design, there will be a method or a methodology, there will be your findings or your results, and then you will reach a conclusion. So your literature review is driven by the aims, objectives, scope, and time available to you. If you recall last night, we said, for instance, a narrative review might take you 1 to 3 months. As the reviews increase in their depth and their analytical purposes, the reviews might take longer. So scoping review maybe from 3 to 4 months, but the other reviews that go into more depth will take a considerable longer time and can be up to 9 months to a year. So we also spoke about which reviews would be appropriate for the different types of review types, and I will be repeating some of it. But just to gain a fuller picture that the literature review isn't just a thing that we do in the middle of our research project, but to some extent it's also a research project on its own with these different aspects to it. So just to recap in terms of the steps, last night we started by saying you will be doing a scoping, finding literature, you will analyze the literature, you will synthesize the literature, and those are the major steps. So for the same, I'm just doing a short review tonight, just in another way. So you will design your review, you'll conduct the review, you'll analyze, and then you will be structuring and writing the review. So very similar, as we said last night, we're just adding now the aspect of writing the review. So there's also a link for you to a specific article that also describes these steps stepwise. So let's just think about when we talk about designing a review or designing a literature review. Whenever we embark on a project of scientific value, we always ask ourselves, who's the potential audience of this review? Now, as I mentioned last night, the audience of your research project and your review on master's and doctoral level is the examiner. On an honors level, your potential audience is the person who will be evaluating your research project. So that might be your supervisor, and not necessarily an examiner, but for master's and doctoral levels, our potential audience is the examiner. And after if you decide to publish your literature review, it will be the reviewers of a journal. So keep in mind who's the audience of the review. That goes for any scientific writing. Then in the design phase, we ask what is the purpose of this review. We discussed last night that different reviews answers different questions. And so you will also formulate a purpose for your literature review specifically. So these aims and purposes are not necessarily the same as your research project's aim and purposes, but it's the aim of the literature and the questions that you want answered by your literature review. Then, if you are doing a critical review or meta-analysis, meta-synthesis, there will be a choice in what method you use to meet the objective of the review. You'll be formulating your search terms, you will be formulating inclusion and exclusion criteria, and you'll also be identifying databases or search engines. Now, I'm going to show you how to apply all of these aspects as soon as we're done with the overview of these processes in terms of a project. Then we're actually going to conduct the review where we then operationalize what our design and our planning. So first of all, we always need to check if the plan in stage 1 produces the required result, or does it need amendments. It's possible that you can have a research question for your literature review. You can have the planning phase in place, and then maybe you start with your literature review and you discover that you maybe need to refine a search term, or you might need to group it differently. So I'll give you an example. I was doing a literature scoping review, and I was looking at the support that's provided to postgraduate students. So one of my key terms at one stage was supervision. And I soon discovered that when I got my results after putting in the key terms, that I found a huge amount of articles that referred to supervision in the work, or supervision of clinical practice, or supervision of clinical psychologists. So I realized that the term supervision was too broad, and that I needed to refine it to specifically state postgraduate supervision. So there might be times when you need to refine, or that you need to revisit. So what is very, very important when you're conducting a specific review type, that you document your decisions. That's important because you are going to need to provide a quality or an audit trail, so that if someone else wants to repeat it, they can actually repeat it to see if they come up with the same results, or if is it different? So for instance, when I reported on that scoping review, I would say that initially I used the broader term supervision and realized that too many articles didn't meet the criteria because it was too broad a term, and what I did then. So please, from the very, very start, even if you do just elementary searches, please jot down, for instance, if I put in the terms, term 1 and term 2, and I search, I get X amount of articles. From those articles, I found that X number met the inclusion criteria. But we'll speak a bit more about that. But even from the very start, please keep a log or a place where you can document the decisions that you make throughout the process. And then always keep in mind that how will quality be ensured. Now, last night we spoke about choosing top journals in your field or top authors related to your topic, looking at what's the quality of the journal. Also, we looked at how are we ensuring that we have quality articles, what are the quality criteria to measure whether we are working with peer-reviewed. Quite often, that's one of the criteria when we are working with scientific literature. That's now not including necessarily grey literature, but when we are working with books, journal articles, and dissertation, thesis, and scientific works as that. Then the next phase is when we start analyzing. Remember, we said last night, when we analyze, we take apart, and when we synthesize, we put together again. So once we have we've selected our literature that we're going to investigate, we will start analyzing. We need to remember what the information needs to, what needs to be abstracted to fulfill the purpose of the scientific review. And I'll give you examples of that. Analyzing within a work and also between works. Comparing and contrasting, we'll speak a bit more about that. But when we compare and contrast our findings or our results, it is on a higher level than merely meaning we describe what we found. So by virtue, all reviews are critical in nature. But a critical review has a specific methodology. So even if you are only describing, for instance, for an honours project, the criteria would be that you could get away by merely describing, but from a master's level onwards, the expectation is that you move up in terms of the ability to compare and contrast and use critical thinking skills and reasoning skills. While we analyze, we intensify, we really look in more depth, we look at concepts, what's their intrinsic value, we're looking if there's even a deviant cases, we're looking for different discourses, we might be looking for the relationships between concepts or ideas, discourses. And last night I mentioned having mind maps might be useful so that you can sort out the ideas and grouping together themes. If you're going to present it thematically, maybe before you start writing up, because it's easier to move around before you start writing than moving around paragraphs and then ending up with a piece of writing that doesn't have logical coherence. and we'll touch on that as well. So just to summarize, on an honours level, our literature review is more narrow in scope. This number of sources is limited. I know the question might come later on, so how many sources do I need? So I can't tell you how many sources you need or is expected. Sometimes on an honours level, they might be very specific and say that you need to have consulted, or your literature review needs to contain at least 20 authors or 20 articles, or it might be narrowed in scope in honours study, but it generally won't be for a master's and a PhD. You will continue until you have answered your research question. So for honours study, the focus more is on summary and an early critique maybe, but the scope and the depth is narrower. On a master's level, a clear methodological process is needed, more critique, and then moving to synthesis, where on honours level, you can describe, and you might not need to go to a synthesizing process. But on a PhD level, you go in greater depth, both conceptually and across different reviews, where you might look at multiple theoretical strands, and you will definitely include a methodological reflection. So, for example, a PhD review identifies how Western trauma theories fails in Indigenous health contexts. So those are level-specific adaptations that we also mentioned last night. So for honours level, descriptive, narrative type of literature reviews are fine. On a master's level, we start getting a bit more critical. Scoping reviews are usually sufficient for a master's level, but PhD level, you could choose between integrative reviews, systematic reviews, and tonight we're talking about a critical review. But just remember that all reviews by nature requires critical thinking. So if we're looking now at an application, for instance, defining review objectives, remember in the beginning we said you need to clarify the purpose of your review, and it needs to, your research questions need to align with a purpose. So for example, your purpose or objectives could read something like the following: to examine how leadership coaches support Gen Z's mental health in corporate settings. So then you will have specific key concepts that you're going to look at: leadership coaching, support, Gen Z, mental health, corporate settings. And you can already see that any of these key concepts will get to a place where you start to now need to link how these concepts are related, and then eventually reach a conclusion. Or something like to explore theoretical perspectives on neurodiversity in postgraduate education. I'm not just giving you broad examples, but your objectives will depend on the type of review you're doing. So for a scoping review, our question might be: what is known about supporting postgraduate students? So it does exactly what the name says. It scopes. It is broader in nature, where when we get to critical reviews, our objective is usually much more focused, and there is opportunity for cross-comparison and also interlinking of concepts. Now, earlier we also mentioned the aspect that our next step would be to select databases. These could be databases such as EBSCO, Scopus, JSTOR, Sabinet. There's specific search engines for economic sciences. There could be specific search engines for health and medicine. Academic edu is a very broad search engine, but last night I said please visit the library sites, and there you can find a large scope of search engines, and very often I start with academic plus, which is a broad search engine and might include many others as well. But the library can also help you with that. Then you need to identify what is your search strings. So that means what is the concepts that you're looking at and how are they combined. So for instance, I combined then postgraduate supervision. And so what it will now do is search for articles that contain both postgraduate supervision and mental health or well-being. And I could then include distance learning or ODL and South Africa. So your search strings, please document these very carefully so that you can provide them in your methodology or tell the reader what search strings did you have and if you adapted any of these. And the library will also be able to tell you when you use and, when do you use or, and how just the and or may also determine the type of articles you are then able to retrieve. Remember, we also spoke last night in terms of our research strategy that we have inclusion and exclusion criteria. So inclusion criteria would be limit the search to articles published or literature published from 2013 to 2025. Or for my scoping review, I only looked at articles pre-COVID. So from 2020 to 2023. And then one of my postgraduate students looked at the publications 23, 24, 25, so 23 to 25. And we specifically wanted to see between the two scoping reviews if there was a difference between the supports that was delivered to students pre-COVID versus post-COVID. So you can limit your range as you see fit. But please remember that with every decision that you make, you need to be able to justify why. If you say 2013 to 2025, why? Why limited to these years? So I've just given you a justification why the one was 2020 to 2023 and the other one was 23 to 25, for instance, and what the reason was behind those. So every decision you make, you must be able to justify. The same as what you would need to justify any research decision you make in your research overall. Then we say that, for instance, all the articles need to have been peer-reviewed, and we're only looking for articles published in English. Now, peer-reviewed is usually easy to justify. It has to do with quality. And then the language you search in, usually the criteria is, because you only understand English, but then you must also write it up as a potential limitation. So, for instance, we can't probably speak Spanish. So when we're only saying English only, we might be excluding valuable research or other discourses but we then write it up as a potential limitation, and we can write recommendations around it. So please, when I mentioned just now to keep a log of all the decisions you made, this is part of the log that's very, very important to keep for audit trail purposes, and so that you can also report on the methodology and the strategies that you followed. So once we have our articles, we've extracted the articles based on our inclusion-exclusion criteria. We now will start to maybe our sifting process would start with the title, then maybe we'll read the abstract. Based on that, you might sift to some degree, and then decide whether you're reading the full text and whether you're going to include the article. Using Prisma is often helpful. I'll talk about Prisma and the other documentation, flowcharts and checklists for all the studies, but one of these types of flowcharts that would also document your decisions is often helpful. So, for instance, we want to include empirical studies on postgraduate support. We want to exclude non-higher education context, and we want to exclude commentaries. And then we write our outcome. So from the 120 articles, for instance, 34 would be included after the screening based on our criteria. So you also document the numbers in terms of what your searches delivered. Now, please don't get a fright. If your search terms are very broad, then you might have thousands of articles that come up based on your search terms. So it's also a process of seeing what you get, potentially refining terms or combination of terms until you find the most appropriate combination, and that you can narrow down the number of articles and that you include in the final a number of articles that you look at. You can definitely not look at thousands. So usually by the end of all these sifting processes, my PhD student, for instance, ended up with 9. I ended up with 77 that I eventually chose, and of the 77, for instance, I included 40. So you can see just by a difference of the years, the results might look different. It could also be different if we change context. What I also found that if I broke postgraduate students down to master's students and doctoral students, that those results were also different. So depending on our search terms, we might have different results. But please, there's never a wrong result. It's just what it says to you, and then what conclusion you reach based on that, and maybe refined strategies. Then once you've identified your articles, it's often useful to create a matrix. Now, I know this next slide is very tiny, but I'll tell you, talk you through a matrix. Now, a matrix could be an Excel spreadsheet. It could be a landscape Word document, where you have headings, for instance, where you can capture the main aspects of the articles. So it could be the author, then what was the aim of the study, what theory they maybe use if you're interested in that, what method did they use, what was the key findings, what were potential limitations, and then maybe leave a space where you can write your notes that would maybe assist you when you start analyzing your papers. So the headings can depend on what you're looking for, but you'll also always have the author and the date, usually always the aim, usually always the method, definitely always the key findings. And then if you are looking for very specific aspects, so for instance, the aspect of theories that they use, that might be something that you're looking at, or it might not be. So your matrix usually would depend on what you're looking at, and so you will generate a matrix for the entire number of studies that you had, and then you would start with your data extraction and organization. So this is already a piece where we start analyzing the data, meaning we are taking it apart. Now, we also spoke last night about the critical aspect and the critical appraisal. So last night we also mentioned aspects of how do we view the credibility of the source. Can we see that a rigorous process was followed? Is their methodology suitable? Are there any traces of bias? Is it relevance? So there are a great number of checklists that you can use to appraise the credibility. And I will also give you some more examples of checklists. So for instance, you can ask yourself, does the author declare positionality? Remember, positionality might influence bias. Is the sample appropriate for the method? Is the theory well applied, or is it superficial? It depends on what type of review you're going to have, but there's always a critical appraisal of our sources. Then an aspect that I don't know if you recall, but when I said for a PhD study, that there will always be a reflexivity in the process, the review process. So in this reflexivity, we acknowledge our lens and its influence. So for instance, you might question whose voices are included or excluded. So for instance, when I did the scoping review, I, for instance, said as a supervisor in an ODEL institution, I noticed that literature from the Global South was underrepresented. And this prompted me to include grey literature and theses from African universities, for example. Also jotting down, based on our reflexivity, what decisions we made based on that. Otherwise, we declare our lens and a potential influence of that in our study. And it's not necessarily that your lens is wrong or right. It's not about wrong or right. It's about being open and transparent. All right. So otherwise, the reviewer or the reader is going to ask, what was your lens or what was your potential bias? Because there's always some bias involved, and it's about acknowledging that bias and working with it. It's not that you need to hide it. And I think that's very important throughout the research project. Then the next step, very, very important, and we'll talk in a bit more depth, and that comes to the writing of the critical review. Now, you can decide how you want to organize your review. You can organize it, for instance, by themes. You can organize it historically. You can organize it from external to internal, global to local. It depends on your question and what type of analysis you did. But please be aware, and that's something I mentioned last night, is that you organize by concepts or themes, not by authors. Now, what I mean not by authors, and it often happens, especially when you're a novice in starting to write scientifically or doing a literature review, is that you will say, for instance, Maritz said A, B, and C. Kumalo said A, B, and D. Zulu said A, B, D, and E. So that is by then you're organizing by author, and there's no integration. It's merely organized by an author, and there's no critical appraisal. There's no critical depth in terms of starting to compare and contrast, analyzing and synthesizing. So I think it's a common issue that I pick up, especially if it's novice researchers or emerging researchers who are just starting off. So that's not what we want. We want to have it, there's some organization or some synthesis going on. So examples of structures. Your literature review is based on the general writing principles of there's an introduction, there's a body, and there's a conclusion. Now, the structure of your literature review is very similar. You will have an introduction to your literature review. The body will contain your strategies or your methods and your findings, and based on that, you'll reach a conclusion. So whether you are writing an honors level project, whether you're writing a literature review for a master's or a PhD, the general structural writing is the same. It is when we start engaging in the methods and the refinement or the depth and the criticality of our findings or our results that the difference starts to show. So for example, after your introduction, which might include the purpose, the scope, and the method, you'll have your analysis or your findings. So for instance, if I did a thematic presentation of the findings of the scoping review, it could be in terms of, for instance, supervision as care, mental health as barriers, material supports, or whatever themes I then identified. And then very, very, very important is a critical conclusion. Remember yesterday we said that when someone also put in the chats the issue around the golden thread. Now, a golden thread also involves your logical reasoning, your argument, or your thesis statement. So that would be a golden thread that moves throughout your literature review, and keeping to a logical and coherent flow. External and internal, but that at the end of the literature review, it is basically based on the same that an argument is based on. where you have a claim, you have evidence, and you reach a conclusion. That's why your literature review chapter will always have a conclusion. There might be a summary presented as part of the conclusion, but because it takes the form of an argument, you need to get to a place where you reach a conclusion. So based on all the readings of all these articles, the findings, what do you conclude? So for instance, my conclusion were that for instance, current research remains siloed and lacked integrated support frameworks. It can be a more elaborate conclusion. It can be a conclusion on multiple levels. Say, for instance, I included looking at methodologies, or I included looking at certain populations. One of my conclusions after I saw that there was a difference in the support for master students versus doctoral students, one of the conclusions was, for instance, that master students receive this type of a support and PhD students receive this kind of a support, and therefore also reach a conclusion. So there can be many levels of a conclusion. But that is where your critical thinking and your criticality then also comes to a point. So we talk about critical reviews and how it would differ from honors level where maybe description would suffice, is that aspect of the thematic synthesis. All right. So we start, as I said earlier, potentially looking at relationships, tensions, discourses, and you can then synthesize these into a part of your argument that could also then relate to your conclusions. With previous and I, for instance, looked at whose voices are included, excluded, and we spoke about how that influenced. Now, that could also be a part of the conclusion that I reach in the end. Okay, I think there's a duplication of slides for some reason. Let me just check. All right, so what I'd like to show you is, for instance, how a method section is written up. Now, this was very brief for an article, but it gives you an idea how you might report on for instance, your methods. So that could be, for instance, this author said the first two authors independently conducted literature searches via Google Scholar. So now they are saying what the search engine was. Now, you can already start thinking about the quality when you think about Google Scholar as a search engine. I'm not saying I have anything against it, but for instance, I'll be wondering, why did they choose Google Scholar as opposed to EBSCOhost or JSTOR or any other search engine? So hopefully they will discuss that in the article. Then they tell you a bit about the inclusion criteria, reviews that appeared from 2019 up to July 2021. Then they give you the sets of search terms that corresponded with the inclusion criteria. So they had the terms review, meta-analysis, or synthesis. The second search stream was social media, social networking, Facebook or Instagram. Third stream, well-being, mental health, also psychopathology. The fourth, adolescents, youth or children. And included studies had to be published, reviews that focused on SMU, mental health and adolescence. So just a small example of how you might write. So on a if you want to, you can, in honors level, also write a short piece in terms of the methodology of your literature review, even if it's a narrative review. It's always useful for the reader to know. On a master's doctoral study, we would do it on a master's level. You might get away with it, but if you're using a scoping review, you will have to report on your methods. On a PhD study, you'll have to report on your methods, and that's why it's so important to keep an activity log and a decision log so that you can report on it. So if we had to now just look at this example and look for quality, all right, so they are pretty transparent. The authors, we know that there's 2 authors, that they did independent searches, and so that means I would imagine that at some stage they came together and they compared. So we can already think that potential biases, individual biases, might have been eliminated by this process. If you're looking at more advanced reviews like critical appraisals, even scoping reviews, there's some journals that would say that there needs to be at least 4 reviewers to potentially dissipate the instances of biases. So they want to see that there was a research team. Now, you can argue that 2 is a team. Sometimes you can add, for instance, a librarian as part of the team if they assisted you. But we already can start looking at the credibility potentially of these findings. So they give their inclusion criteria. They didn't necessarily say what the exclusion criteria are, but they gave us their search engine. They reported on the research strings. And what I would imagine would follow now is their findings. So all in all, they do give us most of the information that we would be looking for in terms of brief methodology. If you are doing, and we'll get to the PRISMA and other checklists, there's potentially more information, but this would, for instance, suffice. On a master's level, if you wanted to, in your honors project, always nice to know. So when we start writing the review, we need to write the motivation and the need for the review, and we need to communicate that, and that simply refers to what was the aim of the review. So what was the motivation for conducting the review? And so, for instance, a scoping review, you wanted to do a preliminary scope of the field before you maybe embarked on a meta-analysis or a critical review or integrative review. In a critical review, your motivation was potentially to critically look at the theories that are included on a specific phenomena, for instance. So very important, you'll always tell the reader what's the purpose and objectives of the review. And then depending on the approach, the final review, for instance, the article can be structured in different ways, and we've spoken about it, and it will require different types of information and different levels of details. Now, the checklist that I mentioned, we mostly use PRISMA for systematic reviews and RAMSIS for integrative reviews. PRISMA is also useful for scoping reviews, and these are simply checklists. So when we look at just an example, the PRISMA for scoping reviews or integrative reviews, it was published in 2018, and it contained 20 essential reporting items and 2 optional items to include when completing a scoping review or integrative review. So yeah, for scoping reviews, they serve to synthesize evidence and assess the scope of the literature on a topic. Integrative reviews might look into more depth and look at aspects between phenomena, but you can refer back to the slides that we spoke about last night. And among the objectives, for instance, scoping reviews help to determine whether systematic review of the literature is warranted. There is where you can find the PRISMA sites. These checklists undergo review often, and items might be added. It's seldom that there are items that is taken away, but very often these items are also evaluated over a period of time. So usually when you provide the write-up of your literature review, scoping reviews, and the others, not necessarily a narrative review, you will use the PRISMA for reporting as well. So the PRISMA will be very specific, where you would say, what was your inclusion exclusion criteria, what were the search engines, what were the key terms or the search strings, how many articles did you have, how many were deleted or duplicates, how many were found its way and met all the inclusion criteria for a final synthesis or first analysis and a synthesis. So the reporting structure is set out, and it's then over reviews, it is a more systematic way of reporting. And you can then also, based on the PRISMA, compare and contrast different reviews. So be that someone has done a review on a specific phenomena, topic, or concepts, and that would also then give you the potential of looking at other dates or refining it to some extent. So you might come about find that in your review that other people have also done a similar review. Keep those reviews at hand. They might be useful for inclusion in your study, or it might be useful to compare and contrast as well. So as I said right in the beginning, your write-up would follow the outline of an essay, or most reports, an introduction, main body, and a conclusion, and we've spoken around those. Then very important writing principles. Please paraphrase, and that means using your own original words to restate information, or to restate your understanding of the either findings or what the claims that's made in an article. So please, especially for the young researchers, don't or keep it to a minimum to have direct quotes. You will find that when you put it through Turnitin, the direct quotes also put up pushes up your similarity index. Even if you do reference it, it will increase the similarity increase percentage. But please, when you paraphrase, it must be in your own words and keeping with the original meaning of what the author said. So just a tip as well, be careful not to use a secondary source. So for instance, Maritz in Zulu said, then you're using Zulu's interpretation, or Zulu's interpretation of your interpretation. So it's always best to go back to the original source, and that's just a general good academic writing. So paraphrasing doesn't come too easy. It comes with practice. There is software that can help you with that, but it's something that you need to learn to do as a writing technique as well. And it comes with practice. So if you do use software, use the software to learn from it, not that it does your work for you. All right, so paraphrasing and writing comes with practice. In your summaries, focus less on the individual message and more on the main message of the source. So what are the main either findings, the conclusions? So less in some instances, the author's voice is maybe one of the aspects that you look at. But generally, we're focusing more on the main message of the source. I've also given you a few reporting verbs. I find very often that when we are young academic writers, we run out of verbs, and we tend to say, Maritz said, and then Zulu said, and everyone said, up to a space where you can't stand the word said anymore because you don't know what other verbs to use. So here are a few of Google's high frequency reporting verbs. Say, suggest, argue, claim, point out, think, find, report, identify, indicate, show, propose, describe, discuss, give, or develop. There's many others. There's hundreds of other verbs. Please just make sure that you use it appropriately in the sentence. So if you're not quite sure that the verb goes with what you're wanting to say, please try another. Everyone can't necessarily suggest, and not everyone can necessarily indicate, and not everyone necessarily discusses. So please also try to keep the verbs appropriate to the sentence that you're using it in, and what you want to actually express. So yes, just another example of an abstract. Could be an introduction that follows quite a nice argumentative style. So it gives you a claim. Higher education aims for university students to produce knowledge from the critical reflection of scientific text. So there's a claim. Now you can see they start to argue, therefore developing a deep mental representation of written information is important. Now they give you what is the objective of this research, or of the search, was to determine through a systematic review and a meta-analysis the proportion of university students who have an optimal performance at each level of reading comprehension. So they tell you that they did a systematic review. They give the inclusion criteria. They give you the search engines that they used. They tell you there's 2 reviewers that perform the data extraction. They tell you how they did the meta-analysis, and they did 2 types of analysis, also a meta-regression, and then you can see at the end 7 articles were identified, and then they start giving you the results. And then they get to a conclusion. Comparing reading comprehension levels is significantly higher proportion of university students have an optimal level of literal compared to the rest of the reading comprehension level. So that's their conclusion. And then they give a potential caution or maybe a limitation. The results have to be interpreted with caution, but are a guide for future research. Right, so I hope all the theory that I have chatted around and given you, and you can now see in terms of when we write it up, what it looks like. And then in previous of the literature review sessions, I also included this slide to also just give you an idea when we talk about critical reading, critical writing, critical reviews. And we compare it, those of you that's in education will know about Bloom's taxonomy. It's used on for different purposes, but I think Bloom's original taxonomy was, sure, I don't want to lie, but around the 1960s or thereabouts, and it's gone through various revisions. But Bloom, if we look at critical levels of thinking, and also then writing, you will see that it goes from the basics and basic, and then it becomes more abstract, where it also applies to our types of literature reviews and on what levels we can expect. So Bloom, for instance, says at the very bottom level, knowledge is gained through remembering. So on this level, we define, we repeat or we restate. So very often personal narratives, for instance, would fall on this level. Scientific writing, we move a level up where we want to understand, apply, analyze. Can you see where our verbs come from? Because they go in levels of abstraction and levels of criticality. So when we look at our critical reviews, they typically move up into the different levels of criticality. And you'll also see on a basic level, we explain ideas or concepts, or we define them. Then on apply level, we use it to demonstrate, interpret our data. For instance, when we analyze, we differentiate, we organize, we reorganize. And then when we're at the evaluate level, we start to appraise, argue, defend, and then on the very top level, you get your scholarly and creative writing, where you start synthesizing information and create original arguments, hypotheses, or creative works. So you can see that it's very similar to Bloom's taxonomy, that you also, your literature reviews, the types would also increase in levels of criticality. So maybe just a reminder how these might look in terms of Bloom's taxonomy and in levels of abstraction. So nearly at the end of my talks, I'm kind of restating in different ways. So if you maybe missed or couldn't understand, I'm giving it to you in multiple forms. So this aligns to Bloom's taxonomy. On a knowledge level, we present information from a source text so that the reader can understand and comprehend. So definitions, summaries, tables, diagrams, basic level. Then on the next level, when we move to comprehension, We summarize, describe, paraphrase, interpret to help the reader understand a piece of writing. Then on an application level, we describe a concept. We also explain why it's essential, where it's been used, how it's been used differently. When we analyze, we are comparing, contrasting. For instance, Jones shows 3 components. Dlamini identify 5 additional details, whereas Dory only mentions 2, for instance. There you can see there's a level of criticality coming in, and then synthesis, although the literature shows that this concept has 3 essential characteristics, these characteristics are shaped by whatever that might be. And then at the level of evaluation, this is the level where you make judgments. Now that I've done this review, the study, what is missing, logic and reasoning, your limitations, and this shows your scholarly performance. So I hope that this gave you an idea of the levels of conceptualization in terms of the different literature reviews as well, how to conduct a critical review, how the outline would be, the reporting needed in terms of a critical review, similar to integrative and a systematic review. And now nearly the last of the last. How do you publish your literature review? Remember last night I mentioned that the literature review done properly is publishable, and that's very often a very early publication that you might have. And you might be able, journals are accepting scoping reviews. Some journals will accept critical, systematic, integrative reviews, but even on the level of a scoping review, the journals are quite open to publish these. So if you do it thoroughly from the beginning, you have an audit trail, you write up critically, this can be a first publication for you already. So when we want to publish these types of reviews, always, and this goes for any publication, is that you communicate what is new, noteworthy, or different. So I very often say it's a so what. When a journal editor or a journal reviewer reads your literature review, they will ask themselves, so what? If there isn't a so what, if there isn't anything new, noteworthy, or different, you're not going to get it published. So please make sure that the justification, your methods, your analysis, your conclusions are in line with a solid argumentation where you put out the so what. So what is new, noteworthy, or different, and why should they then publish it? So, for instance, creating a timeline for analyzing and predicting where potentially a field is heading would be very noteworthy, or a comparison of different related terms or constructs that can serve as a base for theory development, or identifying actual knowledge gaps in previous research. Or it could be identifying trends in terms of methodologies. Maybe you found that for this phenomena, it's mainly been looked at from a quantitative methodology, and you can then justify, for instance, why more qualitative approaches are needed. So very important when we want to publish is make sure that we have a new noteworthy or a contribution, at least a contribution. It can be many things, but that there's at least some novelty where the editor may say, okay, I think this is worthy of going out for peer review. Sometimes they scan through it and they say that this is not for this journal, or it's not adequate, and they don't even send it out for review. So if you do a solid piece of work, then there's definitely a possible contribution in terms of publishing. So how would you know if journals would, for instance, publish a type of a literature review? Please go to the journal and go to the journal guidelines. Usually in the journal guidelines, they will tell you if they accept theoretical papers. So for instance, in this journal, Higher Education Research and Development, they state that empirical, theoretical, philosophical, and historical articles that address higher education in any of its dimensions will be considered. So we know now that they will consider theoretical papers and literature, critical literature reviews, synthesis, integrative are theoretical in nature. Can also be theoretical because you're looking at theories. They would look at these articles. They also consider drawing on a range of theoretical and methodological frameworks. And yeah, is the key that I said in the previous slide. All articles must propose fresh critical insight into the area being addressed. So the criticality and the fresh insights, the so what, is something that the journal editor will look for. And then they will also say for which audience you need to write. So this journal asks for that it would be framed for an international audience. So if you have a literature review focused on, for instance, only the global south, you can do that, no problem with that. You just need to translate them in terms of your findings. What are the implications for an international audience? So you need to go one step further and also then think about the international audience and what this review could potentially mean for an international audience. So yeah, that's from that, for instance, I could gather, yes, I could potentially submit a critical review, integrative systematic review, or a theoretical review to this journal. So now you know what to look at from journal guidelines to see if they will accept these type of articles. And lastly, can you believe it? Just a short slide on common problems. I'll read it for you because the print is a bit small. Common problems: over reliance on low quality sources. Remember last night I said garbage in, garbage out. Low quality sources leads to low quality outcomes or results. So please, we've gone through various iterations of what quality criteria might look at. Often a lack of landmark or seminal literature. This is common to most articles. They want to remember, last night we said we stand on the shoulders of giants, and you don't necessarily always have to go into great depth in terms of these landmark or seminal literature, but at the very least nod to these, so that the reader knows, or the examiner knows, that you are aware of landmark or seminal literature. I'm just thinking where I slipped up with this in my latest article with a student. We looked at Frere's critical pedagogy and education, transformative education, and I did not mention Dewey, who is a seminal author, and they pointed that out to me, and I was quite embarrassed that I did not include that. A lack of current literature, so that the literature is potentially dated, but that would depend on the inclusion criteria and how you justified what type of literature you're looking at. Lack of transparency and reporting. Selection bias, we've talked about that. When you use only literature that would confirm, for instance, your argument or your line of thinking, and not include different discourses or different voices. Description instead of integration and synthesis. So again, very much on a more critical level. Irrelevant or unfocused content. Now, when we just start off with our literature review, it's easy to get distracted because we don't really know where we're going in the first place. So you need to practice at getting focused, and it might take various rounds initially to refine concepts and to refine what you need to look at. So please don't despair, but in the process you need to become quite focused. Poor chapter structure or layout, the same goes for a poor structure or layout of your literature review. Plagiarism or poor referencing or both. And just the level of poor academic writing. So as I said, throughout, writing comes with practice. And a literature review isn't just about reading. We speak a lot about reading for a literature review, analyzing, synthesizing, and you might get the idea that there's no writing involved. But the best way to do a literature review is to read and write and read and write, or write and read. As you write, you might start clarifying thoughts, ideas, and that's also where mind mapping comes in. But an integral part of your literature review during the process, not just at the end when you write up everything, is that you practice writing in various iterations. Remember, last night we also said that it's not a linear process. It's a process that goes to and fro, and it's a process that continues throughout your studies. You're never quite done with your literature review until the day that you submit. Also remember the currency of your literature. If you're on a PhD journey, you're going to hand in 5 years from now. By that time, your literature might be dated. So another good idea in terms of publishing a literature review, if it's solid, as soon as you've done it, for example, then you know what you've done is recent. Otherwise, potentially when you hand in 5 years' time, your literature has become dated or obsolete. So please, if you don't publish immediately, please regularly update your literature review with recent articles, recent discourses, and go back and check that through the way. All right, I think I have now said my bit, and I'm going to go back to the question and answer section. If you'll just give me a minute so that I just load that, and then I will put my camera back on and we can have a conversation. So I just need to take a sip of water while I wait for the questions to load. I hope you've made a lot of notes. And we can start with some of the questions. Kindly confirm for me from last night's session, is it compulsory to submit a synopsis before your start of the proposal? That depends on different, sorry, the camera. That would depend in different departments might have different guidelines and what they want before. Generally, for the departments that I've been working with don't, but there might be certain departments that do. So please just find out from the department's guidelines. Usually that starts happening in maybe in your concept note when you apply for entry into a master's or doctoral program. You might send a synopsis or part thereof, but that might become part of your proposal as well. So please just find out from the department and what their directives and expectations are, right? Please clarify for me, is it advisable to use 2025 references, such as journals? My concern is that when I check them on SkyMo journal ranking, they cannot be found. Would you discourage using 2025 articles and journals, perhaps? If you can't find them on SkyMo, it means that they don't fall into quintile 1, 2, or 3 journals. So it's not about, when you look at SkyMo, SkyMago helps you to identify journals that are in quintile 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you cannot find, it won't find articles for you. It's a way to find out how the journal is ranked. If you can't find a journal on SkyMago, that means that the journal doesn't fall into these 4 categories. It might be that the journal has just launched. So it's not about 2025 articles or references. So I think you might be confusing the two and what they mean. So SkyMago journal looks at the journal rankings and not at references. So references 2025 you will find via your search engines. And in that case, if it's a peer-reviewed journal that the authors have published in and you are happy with their credibility and their processes, then most definitely you can add 2025 articles that would show recency, currency, and where the state of knowledge is currently. So I hope I've clarified what the two are used for and how they potentially differ. Then there's a question on master's level. What is needed in the manuscript? Do you include the literature review? Okay. Also maybe slightly confusing two aspects. So on a master's level, if you're referring to a dissertation, definitely you would have a literature review. If you are speaking about a manuscript isn't on a master's level, can be master's, can be doctoral. And then if you're talking about a manuscript and publishing your literature review as a manuscript, that's something different. But if you are asking whether you include your literature review in on a master's level in the dissertation, then you do. But please, if I'm not understanding you quite correctly, please repost or just give me a further explanation if I don't maybe interpret your question in the correct way. Do we base the review on provided sources only? No, the review is based on, so it might be that on an honours level, you might be given a reference or a reading list. You'll probably not find a reading list on a master's or PhD level. You need to find the sources, okay? And that's what a literature review and the process is about, is how do you find the sources and what do you do with the sources. So usually only on an honours level that they might provide you with some sources, but unlikely on other levels. So it depends on which level you asking the question on, and what the instruction is. So they'll be clear in the instruction whether you only need to use the sources that they supply, and maybe they've done the other the review process for you and given you some articles to work with. But then it's very likely that it's on a honours level. On a master's PhD level, you would need to look for the sources on your own. Okay, and that's why what tonight is based on. Okay, Deneo has given you some ideas in terms of how you can access the links, the PowerPoint presentation, and that it might be from questions that was not specifically related to tonight's presentation. Assuming a quantitative approach, when you refer to findings under the literature review, are those findings strictly from literature sources read, or can the researcher assimilate their own finding post concluding their own study? Okay, all right. So if it's a quantitative approach for your research, then your initial reading of your literature review is that you would definitely, when you've collected the data, you would be integrating your literature review with the data that actually had, or it can be when you have your findings or your results that when you compare and contrast to previous research, you might find additional literature that you maybe didn't cover, or that new aspects came up that wasn't in your literature review. And that's the nice thing when you get to the stage where you can start comparing and contrasting with your own findings. So the literature review is simply that. It's a review of the research and the state of literature at that given point when you did the review. Once you've got your own results or findings, then yes, definitely you start comparing and contrasting. So I hope that answers you when you start assimilating with your own findings. That usually happens when you have your findings and you can start to compare and contrast with previous research. Okay, so I hope the integrity aspect has been cleared. I've looked at a number of LLM dissertations. I've not seen any of them which encompasses the literature review chapter. Does the law master's dissertation not include the literature review? Okay, so we're now talking about the law research processes. It's possible. It's possible that they don't have a literature review, but more that they are potentially looking at cases, at case law, or aspects such as that, rather than potentially a literature review in the more general form of doing things. So possible if you find that that is the trend, or that the department's guidelines, the law department's guidelines uses another form of looking at previous, whether it is research or previous cases or law or such matters, then that might replace your literature review, or the one that we generally think about in research. So thank you for also bringing that up, that some departments and some schools look at literature reviews in a different manner. But I think you are the norm is to have a literature review, but I do know that the LLM and the law departments may look at it slightly differently, but thank you for bringing that up. Can literature be collected through AI? If so, it's reliable, is it acceptable by the university? We spoke about it briefly last night. Be careful. I'm not saying you can't use it. You can use AI, like, for instance, let's maybe give specific examples. You can use applications, for instance, such as litmaps, for instance, where you have some control over the quality of the resource producers. Please do not use ChatGPT to do a literature review for you. ChatGPT hallucinates. It gives you articles that doesn't exist, or even if you give ChatGPT articles and you start working with that article on ChatGPT, it might come up with its own references or give the incorrect DOIs. So ChatGPT I wouldn't use for a literature review. You can use ChatGPT, for instance, to provide you with a guideline or with an outline. That's often useful if you give it the key concepts and your type of review. It can maybe give you an outline, but yeah, depends on what type of AI you are asking or using. So if you are using AI, for instance, like ChatGPT, and you copy and paste directly from ChatGPT, that's not accepted by the university. So please, you need to use it with criticality on your side as well. And that's why I emphasize that you do a literature review through the processes, the manual processes that I have discussed over the 2 evenings, because it would give you the key skills so that you can critically look at identifying sources that are not hallucinated, that are real, the research is real, it happened. So the short answer to your question, can literature be collected through AI? No. Can you use certain applications to assist you? Yes, but you need to know the process before you can critically analyze any other AI applications ability to critically do the same processes at what you may follow. So as I said last night, please don't start off with AI. Once you've become very fluent and very acquainted, you can start to dabble with AI to support. But you need to know, first of all, what is the subject content, so that you can pick up and critically analyze the AI's results. So if you don't know the topic or the subject or the field, then how are you going to be able to analyze whether AI isn't hallucinating or isn't giving you incorrect information or is hallucinating information. So please be careful. I'm not saying that you can't use it in different phases of your literature review, but you need to be the experts when you use it so that you can also critically look at what it gives you. So don't take the shortcut and start with AI. You're going to burn your fingers sooner or later. If you've become quite okay and acquainted and know your subject field, you can use it as a way of checking or potentially conceptualizing with you, or sometimes it can bring unique dimensions that you maybe didn't look at, but you need to know the facts and what is out there by rigorously looking at these processes that we spoke about. Okay, I think this question came up last night as well. Is it possible to use more than one type of a literature review method in one study? Don't do it on a master's level. We're not even talking about that on an honors level. In a PhD, I think the only type of reviews that's combined is that you can combine a scoping review, and then based on the scoping review's results, where you scope the landscape, and you then decide, okay, it's worthwhile doing an integrative review or a systematic review. Then you can use two types of reviews, but remember, each review has a different function. So you need to decide for yourself, what is the aim of your review? What are you looking at? What do you want to do with the review? Because your research questions would be different for the different types of reviews. And what you're looking at will be different. So please go back to the slides of last night, where we unpacked what different types of reviews do, what's the type of questions they can answer, and their methodology. All right, I hope that clarifies. Where in the method of review placed within the outline of the literature review? Where's the method of the review placed within the outline of the review? It is, if you're doing, for instance, a master's, you can include it in the introduction. So you would introduce the chapter, for instance, and in the introduction, like the example that I gave you, that is just very brief, it can fit in the introduction. If you're looking at systematic or integrative or critical reviews, you will have a specific method section where you will unpack the methods, and that would include your research question, your inclusion exclusion criteria, your search terms, and that is unpacked as you would unpack a methodology section in the complete thesis or dissertation. So then the method section is a section on its own. But for a master's study, for instance, if you've done just a narrative review, you can put it in the introduction. How much grey literature can I include at a PhD level? That depends what the reason is for including grey literature. Usually the grey literature is, also go back to last night's slides, there is specific reasons why you may want to include grey literature for a specific reason, and that might answer your question. But usually the grey literature, remember, we're talking about a scientific literature review. That refers to the word scientific, and that would include scientific readings, which is journal articles and books and scholarly documents or text. If you're including grey literature and there's a reason for including grey literature, then that would combine, but the scientific aspect would usually weigh heavier than the grey literature. Grey literature, remember, it would depend on what you're looking at. So if you're looking at policy, or podcasts, or aspects such as those. There could be a reason why you include those, but there is usually a stronger scientific aspect to it and inclusion. Could be brief. Could you brief us on the theoretical framework and conceptual framework in a literature review? As is, that is a presentation on its own. So suffice to say that your conceptual, once you've done your literature review, you can, based on that, end up with a conceptual framework. A theoretical framework, very often, depending master's or doctoral study or what the department wants, sometimes your theoretical framework is a chapter on its own. So you might have a literature review that ends up in a conceptual framework, and then you have another chapter which refers to your theoretical framework. Or if it is a master's dissertation, you could have both aspects, but they are two different aspects. So theoretical frameworks works with theories. Conceptual frameworks works with literature. So you can end your literature as we ended it now, with your conclusions, or PhD level, you can develop a conceptual framework based on the literature, and that would be a additional step. But usually, if it's two different chapters in that, it's usually on a PhD level. So, but there is usually presentations on theoretical frameworks, conceptual frameworks. So please just keep an eye out for those. But more or less the gist of where they would fit in. Okay, so sorry about the load shedding. I know I didn't even realize there was load shedding until Danae told me. So yes, I'm sorry if you missed. Thank you for clarifying reference to critical reviews and the process, particularly sources. Is it advisable to find your own sources, because the ones given, particularly in my research, isn't relevant? I think I've answered that question. So the idea is that based on your topic, your sources would be different. And again, not sure on which level you're basing this comment on, but based on your topic, your sources and your literature will differ. So if you find that they are not appropriate, then go through the processes that we explored tonight to find your own literature. I have a general question. Does our master's dissertation get published by UNISA? It doesn't. No, it doesn't get published. Short answer, no. It does end up in the UNISA repository, but they and people can look at dissertation and thesis as part of the literature review, but that would be an unpublished dissertation or PhD thesis. And yes, by all means, you can use those, but it's not published. So even in the reference section, when you reference a dissertation or a PhD, part of the reference would be it's an unpublished master's or unpublished PhD thesis. So it is on the institutional library and the repository, but not published. Could you please share the criteria for selecting good literature? Please, what I suggest you do is there are a number of slides that we discussed and also iterated tonight, we discuss the selection of good literature. So it is on the slides, but just briefly, when we speak about quality, we're looking at quality journals. We're looking at if these are authors that is well known in the field, if it's trending. A very important criteria is the journal articles peer reviewed. You can, what we also mentioned, and that's where the SkyMago came in, you can check on SkyMago what is the quintile of that journal. Quintile 1 is the top rated tiers for a journal. So a journal in a Q1 is a top rated journal, and that also is a standard for high quality. Not saying you can't use quintile 2, 3, or 4. It's just in terms of your ranking. So when I opened last night, I mentioned identify the top 5 or 10 journals in your field or that relates to your topic. And that's generally, if you've identified those and you start your searches within those top tier journals, you can generally be assume that you've got good quality. So but they are explicitly stated in the slides as well, and you're welcome to check on this. Does UNISA provide any guidelines or resources on this? Please also go back to the slides last night where I have given you where to find the UNISA library, what sort of resources they provide, what training they provide, what additional assistance they provide with your literature review. You've got a librarian that is linked to each department. So there is a lot of support from UNISA. You'll mainly find it on the library website, but I've also given slides on that, so please just check. Ralph, can you please show the similarities and difference between a literature review as chapter 2 in a dissertation and a literature review as in an article? Okay, so the scope is smaller in an article. In a literature review chapter, you've got about, say, 20 to 25 pages, which is roughly around, say, 20,000 words. An article usually gives you between 5,000 and 7,000 words. So you can imagine that it is more concise. So same processes, same headings, same, but it's written in a much more concise and condensed way. All right, and that's the only difference. It's the conciseness. The information that you're reporting on remains the same, but it's in a much more concise manner. All right, I hope that answers, just in terms of the word count, that you can imagine how concise you need to be to rework a literature review chapter into 5,000 words. Just wanted to clarify, is the literature review the first step in the dissertation? My supervisor referred to a draft proposal. I haven't received communication back. Is it the same thing? I just started with my master's. Thank you for clarifying that it's a master's study. The proposal refers to the entire research brief. So your proposal would have your background, it would have your problem statement, which you can gather from your literature review. But your proposal will also have your methodology, what type of a study you're doing, qualitative, quantitative, your setting, your population, your data collection, your data analysis. So that's an entire proposal. Your literature review forms part of your proposal, but it's always good to start reading on your topic. even if it's just to get a broad overview of what is going on in your field or in terms of your topic. You will always use literature at different parts in your proposal. So you will use literature to write your background, you'll use literature to argue the problem, justify why the study is needed, justify your gap, and then the proposal might have a literature review section in it, but it's usually much more concise. So the proposals are usually on a master's level about 20 to 25 pages, where when you do your actual master's dissertation, your literature review chapter might be 20 to 25 pages. All right, so I hope I could clarify a bit, but in the meantime, see if you can find any proposals in your department or that's on the library, so that you can get an idea of what it looks like. Yeah, maybe sometimes the departments also have proposal guidelines or templates, and that might also give you some direction, but always good. We always start reading on our topic because we need to use literature to justify what we do. So start reading. Is there more search engines in addition to the ones provided? Yes, absolutely, Patricia. And so please go back to last night's slide, find your way to the UNISA library, and you will find many different search engines other than those just mentioned. All right. How does one deal with missing data in citations? For example, one may come across a peer-reviewed paper where some information is missing, say the publisher or the book, in which chapter, yes. So in terms of looking for missing information, I usually am able to find the missing information in terms of books and publishers by Googling it, and you should be able to find the publisher or the country in which it was published from Googling. If there's missing information in a journal article, please download the article in full. Most articles have a cite, how to cite this paper, and usually the full citation is, you can find it in that. One part that I do often see that's not included in citations, even within an article, is the page numbers. They're often missing, and then you would, I really do it the long way. I download the article and go and look for the page numbers myself. And it also depends on your citation styles. APA, for instance, doesn't require the page numbers anymore, for example, but Harvard might. So furthermore, is it standard that names follow the format of first name and last name? No, since citations generally have last name and initials, yes. It might not be obvious which is the first name and last name given the two. Virtually every citation style has the surname first followed by the initials. It's very seldom that the citation per se has a first name first. Where you might find a first name first is if it's a book with editors and they have authors for the different chapters. Then the editors would have the surname with the initials, but then if it's published, for instance, in a specific course, just the other way, sorry, the author will have its surname initials, and then the editors would be the other way around. But most citation styles, the surname is first followed by the initials. And please check the citation styles because they're all different in terms of if they use brackets for the date or they don't, where the commas are placed, where the full stops are placed. How do they, if there's if the journal name is italicized or not? So UNISA generally uses, I think most departments now uses the APA 7th edition. Some departments might still use Harvard or Revised Harvard, but please, it's also easy to Google, or that you can ask ChatGPT to do for you. But each citation style is different, but usually without exception, the surnames are first. All right, I hope that was quite a mouthful that I answered that. Prof, would you please show the similarities and differences between, okay, I think I've answered that. I'm doing honors. What's the difference between a qualitative and a quantitative approach? That has to do with your research design. Okay, that doesn't have anything to do with your literature review, but it has to do with your overall research design. So qualitative design, we're looking at working with words. Quantitative, we work with numbers in a very superficial answer, but there are training sessions on all the different designs that you can choose. Oh, I love this one. Who's post-humanism? It's a theory. It's a theory. Okay. So yes, it does fall under a theory. The theory is usually critical post-humanism, and Doty is the mother of the critical post-humanism. But I'm happy if someone is interested in post-humanism, but could also be a philosophy, but definitely also a theory. I completed a thesis 2020. Can I still use my literature review? Probably not. It will be dated by now. You might be able to use some of it, but you'll have to rework it to be more recent. Do we publish our research ourselves? Usually in conjunction with your supervisor. Hopefully, definitely on a master's level, the supervisor may be the co-author, and you publish with them. PhD, you might need to publish on your own, but your affiliation will remain the University of South Africa. The reason for that is that when you publish, there's very often page fees involved, and that the university needs to pay for if it's not open access. PhD, you'll probably co-author as well, 1 or 2 articles before you become the sole author, but please, these are conversations that you need to have with your supervisor early in your initial processes, what's expected in terms of publication. But yes, you draft on a PhD level, you should be able to draft your own articles, and the supervisor might have oversight. Right. Thank you for the lively debates, and not really debates, but chats and questions and answers. It was lovely being with you. I hope the last 2 evenings haven't added to your confusion, but hopefully has maybe explained some of the concepts and some of the ways that we go about our literature review, or at least has just piqued your curiosity to start reading yourself in terms of how to do a literature review. Please, there's many articles that you can find that you can use as additional reading, but that gives you the basis for starting your reading. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, and we might meet each other on the platform again with other topics. Have a great evening. Keep well. Bye-bye.